Hi guys, welcome to Thus Critique Talk, Surveillance in COVID Times. We have two really great speakers with us today. We've had a lot of technical glitches today because there's a little pre-cyclonic storm called Nisarg looming over the coast of Goa right now. But despite that, through various cabling and wiring, we've managed to all come online, which has been a huge feat. Before I start the talk, I'd like to introduce our small little initiative. Thus Critique is a small political collective based in the village of Asagaon that was started by Nilankur Das and a bunch of others. It's a collective that brings together people. Lawrence, you need to mute yourself. Brings together a range of speakers every Monday evening in a restaurant called Gunpowder, which is closed on Mondays, and we sit together and we talk about various worldly issues. And because of COVID, we've gone online, and I guess you're able to sort of it's great because we're getting a wider audience and a wider selection of speakers. Thus is powered by HasGeek today, and we're very grateful to HasGeek. But Thus survives on your donation. So if you will see our page, there's a link to a link to make a donation. So please consider making a small donation to Thus. I'll go on to introduce our two speakers. We have really Lawrence Liang requires no introduction for a range of people working in the legal community. But Lawrence is a professor of the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship at the Ambedkar University. Prior to AUD, he was one of the founders of Alternative Law Forum in Bangalore, which is a collective of lawyers and researchers. Amongst other things, his interests lie at the intersections of law, technology, and culture. He's currently working on Legal Archive's initiative called legalarchive.in. And we have the second speaker, Sanjay Bhangar, who's based in Goa, who's going to, one second, sorry, please. And Sanjay is going to take us, I'll introduce Sanjay again when we come to Sanjay. I'll start with Lawrence first. And I'll give Lawrence the floor. We have roughly 25 minutes each speaker. So Lawrence, do you want to go ahead first? And then I'll give you 20-25 minutes, and then I'll come to Sanjay at that time. Lawrence, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thanks, Alok, and thanks, Nilankur, for organizing this. I'm actually, kind of doing this on a dongle with pretty bad connectivity. So I'll have to turn my video off so that the sound doesn't get interrupted. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll share my screen very soon. Yeah, so basically what I'm going to be looking at today is really the question of what is distinct about surveillance, which is directed towards a public health crisis. And what are the differences in some ways and the overlaps between general concerns of civil liberties and public health exceptionalism. And I'm going to be drawing from a historical account of surveillance and epidemics to ask what lessons may be drawn for the ongoing kind of surveillance kind of responses to COVID-19 itself. So let me first share my screen. So one of the oldest words that we have on record to describe an epidemic is an ancient Hebrew word for the plague called magefa, which is interesting because it's used both as a noun and as a verb. A good reminder to us that pandemics, such as the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, don't just name a virus. They also describe a set of actions and effects. And following Susan Sontag, we can argue that disease has never been merely medical. They are also metaphorical. They become a part of the symbolic network and are indeed strengthened by social meaning. And much after they have outlived their epidemic threat, they remain in some ways as powerful textual and metaphoric constructs. And in that sense, the COVID virus has already entrenched itself well within political vocabulary and everyday language. Terms like social, the new normal, isolation, and surveillance have already taken on new meanings. The one word, though, that has been rather casually strewn about is the word unprecedented. But historians will remind us that there is rarely anything that is ever unprecedented. So let me return to the word magefa. Now, ancient Hebrew was a pictographic language, and the images that came together to designate the word for plague is a combination of three things: a sprouting seed, a foot, and an eye. The sprouting seed, because it was indicative of the plague's disseminative kind of properties. The foot, because it indicated people on the move. And finally, the eye, which was a representation of an awareness or a kind of form of seeing. And it's remarkable that this word Magefa, with its three kind of constitutive pictographic elements, if we had to translate them to contemporary India and what's been happening, they seem to mirror a lot of what we see around us. If we look at the seed in terms of the crisis of food and hunger that a large number of people are facing, if you look at the foot in terms of the dominant images of migrant workers on the move, and finally, if you look at the eye as a symbolic representation in a way of the kind of surveillance regimes that have come up in the wake of COVID-19, the three of them come together in a way to tell us that rarely have we seen as fatal a combination as we do today of a systematic failure of governance and apathy to social vulnerability, accompanied at the same time by a carte blanche exercise of executive power. My focus today will be on the third element of the Magefa, which is the rise of the eye. The most dominant image of surveillance that we have in the 20th century comes to us from the all-seeing TV screen that was Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984. But in many ways, this was literally surveillance in your face. It was marked by an understanding of surveillance as a vertical relationship between the citizen and the state. But in the case of contemporary surveillance, we know that the story is already a lot more complex. And in the marriage of surveillance and the pandemic, there is bound to be a mutation of the very idea of surveillance itself. Unlike Big Brother, who stands in for an authoritarian state, keeping a constant vigil on citizens, the paternal state responding to a public health emergency is a much more difficult, shape-shifting beast to discern, with welfare and warfare being the two sides of the same coin. And to help us understand the nature of this form of sovereignty, it'll be useful for us to turn to one of the most lasting images that we have of the sovereign. And this comes to us from Hobbes' Leviathan. As many of you will be familiar, Hobbes derived his political theory of absolute sovereignty from innate logic of fear. And he understood that the movement of the state of nature, which was a context in which it was war of all against all, into a political society via a social contract, was one in which people gave up their natural rights to a sovereign with whom they would have a relationship of awe and terror. In the post 9/11 world, there's been a renewed interest in Hobbes, but in the context of the lockdown, a particular site of attention has been the cover of the Leviathan. This cover, which was famously designed by an engraver, Abraham Boss, in collaboration with Hobbes, depicts a sovereign figure, a sword in one hand, a scepter in the other, overlooking the sea as the teapot. The body of the sovereign itself is composed of the multitude of people looking up at this transcendental source of power and security. While the traditional focus has always been on this part of the image, the body, draw our attention to the lower half of the etching, where the city is surprisingly devoid of people. The city square is empty, save for a few isolated figures, potentially soldiers. And Falk observes that at the bottom right of the drawing, there are two curious figures walking around the empty city. She identifies them as plague doctors on the basis of their clothing and their beaked masks. This, in other words, was a city that was possibly under lockdown due to the plague. Falk's historical research has been used by various political thinkers, most notably Giorgio Agamben in his book State of Exception, where he observes that the presence of these figures underlines the political significance of the plague doctors and what they had acquired during an epidemic, and the present connection between epidemics, health, and sovereignty. While Hobbes has primarily been seen as a theorist of war and fear, having lived the English Civil War, Thomas Poole, in an article about the image, reminds us that Hobbes was no stranger to the plague. Like many anxious students today, Hobbes had to suffer a 0 year while at Oxford because of the plague in 1606. So in thinking about the precarity of life in Hobbes's imagination of the state of nature, it's not just war, but also disease that serves as a threat to the body politic, as much as it serves as the justification for a theory of absolute power. one of the key arguments that emerges in the Leviathan is derived from the Latin legal maxim, salus populi suprema lex. The safety of the people is the supreme law. If we turn now to the contemporary situation globally, but also focusing on our own context, what is abundantly clear to us is a legal and political exceptionalism that is being justified on the basis of the pandemic and the urgency of responding to it. Numerous legal and political commentators have also alerted us to a multiple layered crisis of legality and legitimacy in the past few months. This crisis, for example, can be seen at different levels. Firstly, at the level of democratic institutions and practices. For over 2 months, 2 out of the 3 pillars of government, namely parliament and judiciary, have been completely absent, and the judiciary is only waking up now, and non-functional when it came to executive decisions about the pandemic. And this has resulted in a rule through executive prerogative, orders, and decrees. Secondly, there's an absolute opacity between legality, legitimacy, and executive authority. Again, commentators have highlighted the fact that all executive action at the central level and at the state level are being taken on the basis of 2 laws and 2 statutes, the National Disasters Management Act of 2005 and the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. Interestingly, the Epidemic Disease Act is less than 500 words long, and the operative word in section 2A is a sweeping word, measures, with the provision providing for measures that can be taken when the ordinary provisions of the law are insufficient to prevent the outbreak of such disease. Faisal Sherwani in an article says that one of the distinct characteristics of this act is the fact that it was drafted at a time when the Supreme Executive and the legislature were indeed the same body, and there was no need for any separation of powers or checks and balances. Thirdly, the use of unmitigated executive discretion from the highest levels to the lowest has resulted not in a trickle down of arbitrariness, but in a torrential downpour of arbitrary orders. So if you consider, for example, some of these examples and how they played out in the domain of COVID surveillance, they range from the relatively benign to the absolutely sinister. On the 17th of March, the Mumbai Municipal Corporation started stamping the hands of those who came from outside India with home quarantined on their hands. Subsequently, many states followed suit, but some went one step further by putting up posters with the names of people who had been quarantined inside their homes, leading to increased ostracization in an already fraught environment of fear and prejudice. In the aftermath of the Tablighi Jamaat incident, there was flagrant misuse of surveillance technologies, including cell phone tower triangulation. A health worker from Assam who had spent 2 days in the Nizamuddin neighborhood and had been under lockdown in Guwahati for over 2 weeks was contacted by the police in Assam, and along with her 87-year-old mother-in-law, were taken for testing. The health minister of Assam had also put up a list on Facebook of every person in Assam who had been in the Nizamuddin neighborhood, along with their names, addresses, and telephone numbers. And many people on the list received threatening and intimidating emails and phone calls. The health department of various states also mandated that people who were quarantined would have to send hourly selfies of themselves at home to prove that they were not violating the quarantine order. We've also seen the rise of what can only be described as vigilante surveillance, with the resident welfare associations in cities like Delhi taking a proactive role in keeping out high-risk individuals, such as Muslim vegetable vendors. And of course, finally, there is Arogya Setu. From initially making it mandatory for everyone living in a containment zone, to extending it to government employees, to making it a precondition for travel and other activities, and finally withdrawing the mandatory status, at least legally, because for all practical purposes like the Aadhaar, it will become optional in law, but mandatory in practice. A resident of Bombay, along with her husband, were taken by the police and the BMC to be quarantined, leaving their daughter home alone. When asked why they were being tested, they were told that their name had appeared on the list that had come from the PMO. It turned out that they had installed Arogya Setu, and a faulty alert had prompted them to appear as displaying symptoms of being COVID positive. All of these executive actions that I've described have been taken on the basis of the National Disaster Management Act, which lawyers such as Suhrit Parthasarathy have argued are clearly in violation of the laws in India. The Supreme Court in the 2017 Puttaswamy judgment held privacy to be a fundamental right under the Constitution. They also made it abundantly clear that any action of the state resulting in a violation of privacy must be tested on the following parameters. A, that the action be sanctioned by law. B, the proposed action must be necessary in a democratic society for a legitimate aim. And C, the extent of such interference must be proportionate to the need for such interference. While it may be relatively easy to make an argument for the second factor, which is the necessity argument, the question of whether it is being done under a valid law and whether it is proportionate is extremely questionable. Following the first Puttaswamy judgment, the judgment in Puttaswamy 2 further clarified what the tests of proportionality in relation to privacy and surveillance consist of. And the court set a four-pronged test in which they said the measure must have a legitimate goal. It must be suitable as a means for furthering this goal. There must not be any less restrictive but equally effective alternative if it exists. And finally, that the measure must not have a disproportionate impact on the rights holder. On the question of valid law, it is argued that at a minimum, there should be a legislation that clearly outlines the goals, the scope, and the restrictions that can be imposed on an app like Arogya Setu. And while it may be argued that given the urgency and given the fact that Parliament has not been in session, it would have been difficult to pass such a law, the fact of the matter remains that the lawmakers, particularly at the state level, have been very trigger happy in using the route of ordinances in areas such as large-scale labor law reform, which really don't have the same level of urgency in the time of COVID. As a comparison, it'll be useful to note that the UK enacted the Coronavirus Act 2020, which was a comprehensive legislation dealing with all issues connected with COVID-19. But even if one concedes that the urgency of the situation demands a breach of the right to privacy, in the absence of a clear legislative framework, what we have governing the use of apps like Arogya Setu are merely the terms and conditions and the by now notorious privacy policy of the app. In the privacy policy of the app, the government limits its liability and states, you agree and acknowledge that the government of India will not be liable for any claims in relation to the use of the app, including, but not limited to, any unauthorized access to your information or modification thereof. Now, even in the Puttaswamy judgment, Justice Chandrachud had explicitly recognized public health as a valid ground on which certain forms of restrictions can be placed on the right to privacy. So I'm not making some kind of reckless libertarian argument as you see developing, for example, in some parts of the US. And this brings me to my second segment. All of these critiques of surveillance are, of course, very important. But these critiques primarily emerge from the perspective of political surveillance, and the question of public health surveillance seems to be a lot more ambivalent. There's a clear fault line that seems to be drawn between the civil liberties tradition on the one hand and the public health tradition on the other, with the former seeing surveillance primarily from the perspective of power and liberty, whereas in the latter, surveillance is not just necessary, but sometimes a desirable public good. There's a remarkable book called Biopolitical Surveillance and Public Health in International Politics by Jeremy Yaude, where he argues and provides us with an excellent overview of this kind of constitutive split between surveillance as intrusion and surveillance as public good. Engaging with scholars who have been influenced by Michel Foucault's work on biopower, or how states acquire power over people as biological bodies through the discourse of health and medicine, Jeremy Yaude argues that Foucault is absolutely right in suggesting that the forms of surveillance and data collected in the name of public health is rarely innocent and is often filtered out through social structures of race, religion, gender, and of course, caste in India. He, however, says that the focus on the political question is relatively blind to the public health imperatives of surveillance. And you can see a lot of the recent manifestations of this critique of the extension of biopower in the writings of Giorgio Agamben and his dismissal of the coronavirus. Agamben has been proven to be somewhat way off the mark in his own assessment of the virus itself, even though the political implications of his arguments continue to have some valency. So Yaude says that while Foucault emphasizes the connections between state power and biological existence, it bears emphasizing that historically, in terms of the fight against infectious diseases, biopower directly encouraged many of the sanitary and health reforms that actually lengthened lifespans and improved living conditions for millions of Europeans. These services and advantages had long been available only to the moneyed elite within society. Public health reforms that accompanied the growth of biopolitical surveillance brought these to the masses, is his argument. And the example that he provides is the story of smallpox eradication. He says that making smallpox eradication a reality took more than just mass vaccination. It actually required surveillance. The smallpox eradication program did not show definitive success until it actually embraced surveillance as its central strategy. And only by identifying every single case of the disease in a given community and then tracking down every person who had come into contact with the case, the eradicators argued, could the international community be certain that the disease had truly disappeared from circulation. So surveillance in this case was not an option chosen for malicious ends. It was central to the elimination of a killer disease. And this, for me, is the precise fault line. How do we balance between these two truths? The necessity of surveillance to tackle pandemics on the one hand, and the dangers of instituting a biopolitical apparatus that will have extremely repressive consequences. One way of looking at this is perhaps to look at this in terms of different models. And Amy Fairchild, a historian of public health, says that there are two models that one can look at in modern history. The first one is surveillance debates that took place in the fight against tuberculosis in the turn of the 19th century to the 20th, where you see this kind of the historic rise of a certain form of a paternalistic surveillance. Surveillance is good for you, it's good for public health. The argument here was that privacy was an unaffordable privilege in the time of emergencies, and that health and welfare trumped any concern of privacy. So this brought the health officials into conflict with a whole range of other departments, including law enforcement. But what struck a chord with the public was the promise that this new regulatory regime would bring within its gaze a class of populations who were otherwise relatively immune from state surveillance and regulation, namely migrants, the working class, and slum dwellers. In particular, African-American washerwomen and Chinese laundries came up for special scanning. Another feature that was rather common during the time of the TB battle is the rise of private or citizen surveillance with neighbors spying and reporting on each other. And while there were some early articulations of privacy concerns with regard to health and medical information, by and large, these remained marginal to the concerns of public health claims, with health officials triumphing and emerging with powers and discretion similar to policing powers. Laurie Garrett, in her book, Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health, in fact says that it was a declaration of war, not just against TB,